Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this Education Writers Association webinar on how the Supreme Court's decision on race-conscious admissions could affect higher education and diversity on campus. My name is Teresa Watanabe, and I'm a staff writer covering higher education at the Los Angeles Times. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. A reminder that this webinar is on the record and is also being recorded. If you have questions for our speakers, please type them into the Q&A box and feel free to ask your questions at any time, and we'll get to them during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Now, let me introduce today's speakers. Paulette Granberry Russell is president of the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. Julie Park is an associate professor of education at the University of Maryland. Angel Perez is CEO of the National Association for College Admission Counseling. And Lisa Prescott is the Director of Admissions at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So Julie, why don't you begin by breaking down the Supreme Court cases, the arguments made before the court, and explain what your own research tells us about these claims.
Sure. So what's going on? So the last couple of years, or really maybe the last decade and a half, has seen a good amount of flurry of litigation around what's called race-conscious admissions. And so that's basically the ability of a college or university to know what an applicant's race ethnicity is and to consider that just in understanding who an applicant is and what their context for opportunity may have been. It does not mean admissions is race-based at all. It doesn't mean that certain groups get in because of certain race. It's just allowing them to know what someone's race ethnicity is and then do whatever from there and understanding just holistically who they are. So this has been come under attack in a couple of lawsuits that were heard before the Supreme Court, University of Texas, Austin, and then more recently, this group by the same person actually who was behind the UT Austin lawsuits, Edward Blum, formed this group called Students for Fair Admissions, and they filed 2 lawsuits against Harvard University, I think back in 2014 or so, and then also against UNC Chapel Hill. And so in particular, the Harvard lawsuit, and I should say upfront that I served as a consulting expert on that case on the side of Harvard, so anything here is my own opinion. That case is somewhat unique because it makes a claim of intentional discrimination against Asian Americans by Harvard. And so that's a little bit different from previous cases where you had white female plaintiffs who were challenging race-conscious admissions policies, saying, I didn't get in because of XYZ. And in this case, you had a group of Asian American applicants who were recruited very strategically by Ed Blum. And so I could talk a lot about this, but I only have about 2 minutes. And so I'll just say in a nutshell, I think my own review of the evidence, and there's been a lot of research behind this, both sides filed very lengthy expert reports. It was really the battle of the statistics in a lot of senses, is that I don't see evidence of intentional discrimination from Harvard. I would encourage reporters to really look beyond face value of the numbers. And so there might be numbers that seem on face value. It's like, oh, this group has this admit rate that is lower than this group. Maybe they're getting discriminated against that. To really understand, there's a lot underneath that. And there are actually a number of differences, in particular at Harvard, between the white and the Asian American applicant pools that help explain why you have slightly different rates of admissions rate for these groups. And that's mainly because the white applicant pool has a much higher representation of both legacies and then recruited athletes, and even just non-recruited athletes who are known to receive some special consideration in the admissions process. So I'm happy to take questions later, but is that good for a first pass?
Sure, that sounds great. Thank you. Angel, why don't you go next and talk to us about the college admissions process, how this could change depending on the court's ruling, and how NACAC and its members are preparing for that.
Sure, thanks, Teresa. I think the first thing that's important to note is that, NACAC members, who, by the way, are the admissions officers who are doing the work at colleges and universities all over the country, as well as high school counselors and school counselors and community-based organizations that are advising students into the pipeline to higher education. So we have a unique lens into this particular process. And I think, Really, there are two different areas where this could impact. One would obviously be when students are applying to the institution, whether or not an institution could actually consider race in holistic college admission. And what that really means is holistic college admission is a process in which institutions try to look at the entire lived experience of a student. And it's actually really, at least we argue in our amicus brief, that it's really difficult to do that without taking into consideration the race of the particular student. Obviously, this could have a tremendous impact on the socioeconomic as well as the ethnic and racial diversity of college campuses. The other area, so there's the admissions piece and how admission officers are able to use that tool. The other area I've been hearing a lot about from our members are the school counselors who are worried about how do they advise their students on applying to colleges and universities, particularly high school counselors who work with predominantly students of color. You know, one thing that a counselor asked me recently is, will I be able to, for example, advise my student to tell the institution in their essay that they are a student of color? And part of what I think is really important for all of us, especially reporters who are covering the story, is to not get ahead of the court. We've really been saying to institutions of higher education, you know, don't reimagine your process yet, because we don't know what the nuances of the decision are going to be. But all that said, colleges and universities have made it clear that they're not going to be moving away from their diversity mission, that is core to who they are and what they need to do. And I'm excited that I know Teresa covers Los Angeles and knows the UC system really well, but also Lisa being here from UC Santa Barbara, I think we're going to learn a lot from the state of California, who's been doing this for a while. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Angel. I already have a million questions in my head, but let's move on and ask Paulette to tell us about how a possible ban on race-conscious admissions will impact diversity on campus and how diversity officers will be forced to adapt.
Thank you. And I just want to express my appreciation to all of my colleague panelists who are here. And I'm learning as I go as well. And when I think about some of the comments that have already been made by both Julie and Angel, I think about almost the immediate impact if a decision from the court were to ban the consideration of race. And having members who are chief diversity officers across the country, and many of whom are doing their work in states with bans, and the impact that those bans had initially, which included a chilling effect, both on students who were concerned about the possibility of being admitted, what these restrictions mean, the impact that it has on them, I think, both in terms of emotional impact, but also the impact of their parents and the adults in their lives, who are now questioning whether or not those institutions will be friendly, welcoming, supportive places for their students. And I think it gets back to that very real example that Angel provided of counselors wanting to know, and they may themselves ask the question of, where is the best place for our students? Will they be supported? What does this mean in the context of support programs on campus, those academic support programs? What does it mean for those social support programs? Will students themselves feel that particularly where their representation based on social identity is not as significant in a predominantly white institution or historically white institution? What does it mean for them? Is that environment now going to have a chilling effect on their success and their sense of belonging, all of the things that we've worked so hard to provide for our students in the context of their success, not only their academic success, but their social success, their success in the broader community. So I think in the context of immediate effect, chilling effect is one. The other is, the ban, if the court were to determine that there is a ban on the consideration of race, we know from experience that it can very real impact on student numbers. particularly among student identity groups that are not well represented currently. We've seen that in the amicus briefs that have been filed in support of UNC as well as Harvard. And some of those coming from states like Michigan as well as California, who spoke very eloquently on the impact on numbers and what those numbers were prior to bans, but also subsequent to the bans, and to the extent that they've had to work particularly hard, not only in the context of how one best represents in the admissions process the lived experiences of students in the absence of being able to consider race as one of many factors as a part of the admissions process, but also what it means for those students who are on campus and their numbers having been diminished by the ban. So for those of us who function in the role of chief diversity officers, it's ways in which we've had to be particularly mindful not only of the impact of students being admitted, but the impact that these bans have on students that are present on our campus.
Yeah, there's just so many questions about what it's going to look like going forward. And we have someone who can answer some of those questions. Lisa, the University of California and other public universities in California have actually been barred from using race in admissions and other services for more than 20 years. And I know that there was a huge drop in underrepresented minorities in the first few years at Berkeley and UCLA. But now I think the numbers show that UC is now attracting the most diverse applicants ever in history, and that many of them are being admitted. So can you take us through UC's experience, and particularly what are you doing in Santa Barbara?
Sure, thanks for including me. I think I come with a unique experience in that I came to the University of California, Santa Barbara as a transfer student myself, first generation student. Once I graduated, I joined the admissions team, and I've been here 40 years. So I've seen quite an evolution of what has happened in the world of admissions. It was July in 1995 when the UC Regents passed SP1, which, prohibited the use of race in admissions. And then California voters in 96 passed Proposition 209 that went into effect with the students who entered the university fall 1998. So yes, we've had almost 25 years of, this prohibition. I think what is critical to remember, though, is our core value has not changed. And UC's core value is to prepare graduates to be productive citizens in California and to provide a path to higher education for all of our students. So that has never changed. That remains our core value. But it has also meant that we have had to build a lot of programming around K through 14. We've thankfully been able to dedicate a lot of our resources financially, as well as resources from the state of California, to develop those outreach programs. And again, while we have the diversity in the state of California, we don't necessarily have the historical experience of those families attending college. So we have pre-college programs in place. Our education programs are working as early as elementary school, and our outreach programs start very heavily working in the 8th grade because we have to build that pipeline of eligibility. UC is very selective, and yes, we have made tremendous efforts, Teresa, but it's still a challenge at the most selective schools when you have campuses like Berkeley and UCLA whose admission rates hover at close to the single digits. It's still very hard to achieve the diversity that would make a campus more rich for all students. We have a lot of outreach programs for low-income students. We have a lot of partnerships with schools that have traditionally been underserved. We have a program that's called Eligibility in the Local Context, by which we look at who are the top graduates at each California school so that we can make sure geographically students from across the state have access to the University of California. We look at that lived experience. We do holistic review. And so a lot of work has to go into training counselors and high school students about how to best present themselves on the application so that we do get a full understanding of what their lived experience has been. Financial aid programs are critical. You know, UC has developed Blue and Gold scholarship plan for families $80,000 income or less. We have middle class scholarships. Most recently, we've created a Native American Opportunity Plan for Native American students from federal tribes. We've also just implemented this year a tuition stability program, whereby families know when they enter the university that their fees will not increase over a 6-year period so they can adequately plan. As far as UC Santa Barbara, thankfully we have a campus that's very committed to this effort and to create that diversity. And I remember being that first-gen transfer student walking on campus, you know, as Mexican-American myself, feeling that sense of isolation and almost, quite frankly, shock. I remember calling home saying, nobody looks like me here. Maybe I should come home. And I do think even, you know, all these years later, students still have that experience. We are still hearing from our African-American students that they are the only student in their classroom, for instance, that's African-American. And so I'm working really closely with the DEI officers in each of our academic units, from everything to how can you make your website more accommodating? How can you show that this is a welcoming department for all students? We are providing paid tours. We send buses to underserved schools in Los Angeles saying, hey, come visit the university for the day, see that it's a place for you, experience it, talk with our student organizations. We work very closely with community-based organizations. One of our strongest tools has been working very closely with our student organizations. Because I need to know, I can call a group of students, hey, I've got a group here from San Diego, and I'd love for a student group to come talk to them. I've served as the advisor for a multicultural sorority for over 20 years. I know I can call on those women when I need them to talk to students. So using our own students to talk to other students is incredibly effective. We have to be very honest. When this first came about, we created a series of videos. One of them was, what is it like to be a Black student at UCSB? What is it like to be a Chicano student at UCSB? And I so vividly, even 20 years later, remember a student in the video for African-American students saying, you know what, it's really hard. So I think you have to be very honest with incoming students about it's not going to be a perfect scenario for you. You do have to find those networks early on. We've created a resource guide we call it the Black Book, for instance, as an example. Here's where you can find in Santa Barbara makeup products for darker skin tones. Here's where you can find barbers. Here are Black-owned businesses. Here are where you can find the Black churches. So we use that for our retention efforts, but it also shows incoming students that we're thinking about these things. So, you know, you have to put yourself out there a bit and say, yeah, there are going to be parts of this experience that are going to be a struggle for you, but we're here to support you. And I know I'm going on and on. I'll just say a couple more things. We train our readers, those who review the applications, how to review holistically. They go through 4 hours of implicit bias training, 2.5 hours of implicit bias training every year. I go through that training every year, even though I've been here so long. We try to train readers about different school settings. You know, we have counselors record videos. What is it like for a student in your high school? What is their community like? We try to share this with all of our readers. I think a lot of people are surprised to know, I know you were surprised to know, Teresa, when you and I chatted, that readers cannot see the name or the ethnicity of the applicant. And we do that intentionally because we don't want them to focus on that. We want them to focus on that true lived experience for the student. So you can see how critical it is that we explain to students how to present themselves on the application so that the reader understands what that lived experience can be. It's been difficult to hire diverse faculty. All of the UCs have struggled with that. We continue with that challenge. It's very difficult to fight social media that often has very incorrect information. Students, it's hard to find students sometimes. It's wonderful. As I'm sitting here, a bus just unloaded of one of our school groups, and I'm seeing this, 50 students walking by, very diverse, coming to learn about the university. So it's an ongoing effort. There have been successes. 5 of the UCs are Hispanic serving institutions now. The other 4 are emerging. COVID has been very challenging. But I think the campuses who are out there who are thinking about this really have to take a very honest look. What are their strengths and weaknesses? Be upfront with families about those, but also share what we're doing to make the campus climate better. As I always say, the best recruitment is strong retention. And so we have to make sure the students we have on campus are successful.
Wow, that sounds great, Lisa. Thank you so much for that big overview. One thing that I want to ask and throw out there to all of our panelists, because this is a question that I also have kind of wrestled with every time I write about this. What exactly is diversity?
Mm-hmm.
I think Teresa may have frozen.
Teresa is frozen, but I think we
can
answer
roll with
that.
her question.
They're evaluating.
Oh, there she is. Are you back,
Okay.
Teresa?
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, my Wi-Fi is a bit sticky. But yeah, what is diversity, and how do we know, or how do you know when a campus is, quote, diverse enough? And we see a lot of presentations saying, well, it doesn't reflect the state's geographical, diversity, or it doesn't have enough of this group or that group. If you compare them to the state, I know that UCLA, for instance, now, thanks to 20 years of efforts, has 7% Black student, which is completely at parity with the state's proportion. But still, I think, Paulette, as you may have talked about, still, if you're only one of 7% on a huge campus of 40,000, you could still feel really isolated. That still may not give you a sense that you belong. You may still seem to be the only Black student or Latino student in that class. So can you all talk about what is diversity, and how do we know when it's enough?
Mm-hmm.
I'm
happy to just throw in one point there, Teresa, and that is, yes, it is easy to say that if you're strictly looking at numbers, but if you look at where are those students represented across all majors and departments, and I think that's one thing that you'll see is that, I can find tremendous diversity if I walk into a sociology class, but I typically will not see that same level of diversity if I walk into an organic chemistry class. So for me, diversity means diversity across all of our academic disciplines. Others can join in.
I was gonna, I think it's interesting that you'd ask the question, because I think one of the justices also asked that question a couple of times. And it's a question that has many responses to it. But I'm going to focus on the issue that is at question here. And that is, in this context, what we're talking about is racial ethnic diversity. That is under consideration by the court. And I think when we, and certainly we can speak more broadly in the context of diversity. We can narrowly define it. We can broadly define it. It can be a range of identities and all of those things. We've got intersecting identities that also impact individuals differently. As a woman who may identify as lesbian and as a Latina, experiences may be very different based on the multiple ways in which I identify. It can include disabilities. It can include veteran status. It can include class. It can include, geographic, whether you're US born or, international. And even within that context, there's a whole vast range of diversity. And the goal of our campuses is to create an experience that allows our students to engage across a vast range of differences and allow them to do that in a way that is supportive, that is welcoming, that creates that sense of belonging that we all aspire our students to have and experience. And so when we talk about diversity, we can certainly talk about it broadly, but in this context, the issue in dispute is race and ethnicity. And I think to the extent that institutions themselves have advocated that it is just one of many factors that create that diverse experience for our students, race is one of those. And we've taken the position as an organization that there is no proxy for race. Which is, I think, oftentimes what we're often left with in terms of some of the strategies that we have had to employ to encourage and perhaps achieve at least some of the racial ethnic diversity that we also believe is very important for our students to have represented on our campuses. So I'm going to kind of leave the question out there for my other colleagues as well.
The only thing I wanted to add, Teresa, because we can go in a lot of different directions with this, and I think the answer to your question would be different based on the state or the mission of the institution or their goals at the time. But one of the things I feel is lost in this argument right now, at least the way that it's being perceived, is that Asian students or white students might, quote unquote, lose if race is taken into consideration. My experience is entirely different from that. I forgot to mention in the beginning that I was a chief enrollment officer at private colleges and universities my entire career before I moved into this role. And I think what the public doesn't tend to understand is that within different racial and ethnic groups, you have an extraordinary amount of diversity. So let me talk about my Asian students, that when I was building a class every single year, I wanted to make sure that the diversity within my Asian students was very rich. And so I wasn't just going to admit students who had a Chinese background. I wanted Vietnamese students, and I wanted Hmong students, and I wanted students who represented different aspects of the Asian community. The other thing I think is lost is with the ability for me to take into consideration race, that is how I was able to identify my white rural students who were low income, because one of the things I felt strongly about, especially at some of the highly selective private institutions I worked at, I did not want every low income student on my campus to be a student of color. That is stratification I did not want to create. And so I very purposefully wanted to include rural white students who had a totally different lived experience than, for example, maybe like myself, who grew up as a Latino in the South Bronx in New York. So I think that's part of what's missing in the conversation, that we're even talking about diversity within diversity in the context of that lived experience.
Yeah, I agree with, the comments that were made. I think just the only thing that I would add is something we say a lot in the research community is that diversity can include numbers and numbers can reflect diversity, but diversity is not only about numbers. And so we look at multiple indicators. One term that's used in the research is dynamic diversity, which was coined by Liliana Garces and Uma Jayakumar, which talks about how diversity is sort of multifaceted, it's ever shifting, it's highly contextual. It can include things, as others have mentioned, about including, the tokenization or marginalization that students might feel. You might have a certain number, but if students are still feeling that, then that might be an indicator that a campus is really struggling still with diversity. Another thing I would say is that, sometimes, and we saw this some in the conversation of the justices, they were like, how long do we need this, right? They were like, how long, what's the timeline, right? And there's this idea that, when are you going to reach diversity? And then you don't have to think about race anymore. And I think that's sort of a false, right? Or that's certainly one way, right? That some people might think about it. But I think what we've seen from experience in saying, you might have a campus that might look a certain way, but without continuous intentional attention and really pouring in and investing and continuously investing in supporting both racial, ethnic diversity, whether it's numerically, demographically, and also in the campus climate and culture, that diversity is going to go away, right? It's something that needs a lot of maintenance and a lot of attention. One note is actually African-American enrollment at UCLA is actually 5%. I was like, 7% sounds a little higher, but I checked and it's actually 5%, which is—
I think 7% maybe in terms of admission for UCLA.
I don't know. I just went to the website in terms of just makeup, 5%. Oh, you were talking about the admit rate?
I think I was talking about first years. Yeah. First year admit
okay.
enrollees. Yeah. First year.
Okay. I don't know about first years. It looks like for the full undergrad, it's 5%.
Yeah.
And it's been even lower than that, which is abysmal.
Yeah. I mean, it dropped, I think Berkeley dropped to 2%, and I think UCLA 1 year, and this is when they really got alarmed. I think they had fewer than 100 Black students in their first year class. So it fluctuates up and down, but I think that I think all of the campuses at the UC have been really focusing a lot, especially on the Black and Latino students, because they have been so underrepresented. I wanted just to follow up and ask Julie, I know that you have followed the Supreme Court decisions and the arguments pretty closely. So tell us, they're not completely banning any kind of race? Because I thought in those arguments, there was a question posed, but if a student wants to write in the essay about what it's like to be, the only student of color in their class, or anything like that would be allowed. And can you just tell us, to what extent can students still write about race? And even if it isn't, the one factor that a university uses for admission, it can still be part of the mix.
Yeah, I think that kind of piggybacks with what Angel said, in that we don't know the specifications of what type of rulings are going to come down, and there are a number of possibilities in what it could look like. Certainly what SFFA, I think, is seeking is to wipe out race. And so I think they want to go as far as they can. But in terms of what is actually going to come down from the justices and what the implications might be, I don't know.
There
I can tell
was, I was going to say, Teresa, I'm sorry.
No,
Lisa?
go ahead, Paulette.
I was just, there was, it seemed like a concession by SFFA when, and I can't remember if it was Justice Jackson Brown or Kagan who spoke to the issues of holistic and lived experiences, and that race can very well impact and define one's experiences. And there was this question of it's almost like the checkboxing argument that I think a lot of people think is happening and was happening. And that's, I think, the substance of the issue for Students for Fair Admissions. And when they were asked whether or not this notion that the lived experiences, if that's written about, is that something that can be considered? And I think there was a concession. I may not have that correct, so I don't want to be quoted. And I would encourage people to go back and, if it's possible for you to review the oral arguments, to do that. But I do, it was that moment where I kind of walked away feeling like, okay, maybe this is not, obviously there's concern for the case itself, for those of us who are advocates for the continued consideration of race. But it's in that broader context of holistic, and the fact that lived experiences and the fact that they're not insisting that somehow you have to eliminate somehow from an essay or a personal statement that a student provides a significant impact on their life, which is their race. So I think that's where that was coming from.
Yeah, and that does sound familiar. And now you're tracking, I think it may have been, someone needs to go back to the oral arguments and the discussion, that there was some discussion, and I forget if it was from the justices themselves or the counselor, et cetera, but there was a note made by someone that says, but we don't want it to be that only if students are talking about it in their essay. We want to consider or allow institutions the flexibility to consider other contexts where race, ethnicity may be salient, even if students aren't writing their essay about it, right? And so a context might be like someone who's in STEM, right, and writes their essay all about, who knows what they discovered, et cetera. But, race, ethnicity might still be part of their story, but maybe they're not writing their essay about that. And is that something that an admissions officer might be interested to know?
Yes.
And I can tell you from an admissions officer perspective, it's very common for students to write about their experiences and how it has affected them. So our readers are trained to not focus so much on the fact that the student said they were a particular ethnicity, but what is the information they're sharing surrounding that? For instance, it was very common during the race riots that were happening in California, all over the country, over the Black Lives Matter issue, for a Black student to write about the fact how traumatizing that was for them. And as a result, maybe they created dialogue at their high school to bring people together to discuss how that was affecting them all. And they took a leadership role in trying to make their campus community a better place. We see students who, Latino students, will talk about their participation in folklorico dance and how their cultural experiences have really shaped who they are by participating in those kinds of activities. So our readers are trained to look for those types of things because it is very common for students to share that background information with us in their essays.
Yeah, that sounds great. Where can journalists look for data and research on this issue? Obviously, with the court ruling probably coming out next spring, everyone is going to be gearing up to do thoughtful stories about this and what it could mean. Do you have any suggestions, number one, for story angles or stories not to do? And number two, good data sources or research to look to inform our reporting?
Yeah, I would suggest looking at some of the amicus briefs that were filed, especially the ones filed by groups of social scientists, because those include a lot of research, but they're written in a way that I think is relatively accessible. And so you have a couple that are filed from different combinations of researchers, and ones also from the Asian American community on both sides, which I suppose are worth reading, and could provide some interesting angles. Really, within all of the amicus briefs, it's interesting to see why someone who's kind of random will file and then see there could be a story there.
I think I absolutely agree with Julie's point about the briefs. And I would encourage folks to take a look at those briefs that were filed by corporations as well as military. The AMA, American Medical Association, I believe also filed an amicus brief, because those get at the issues of the benefits that extend beyond higher education, which is really what this is, I think, all about. It's not just the benefit of students and their lived experiences on our campuses, but what we are generating as a result of those students having these experiences when they enter beyond the academy or beyond their college and institution. And I think those would be very helpful. I would also encourage, and I think this is one for consideration, and I must advocate for it, the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, which is affiliated with the APA and NADAHE. But getting beyond so that people begin to understand, and I think if you're crafting stories that are research, evidence-based research, then go to the sources and the scholars who are engaging not only in what it means in the admissions context, but what it means in the lived experiences of students on campus. And that gives a broader perspective of why this work is so important. You know, so not only is it how we get them there, it's how we keep them there, how we create a sense of belonging, how vast diversity is in this context, as well as what the evidence reflects in terms of the students' experiences, both in and outside the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Teresa, I've been speaking a lot to the media about this, partially because, and I just want to share this with everyone who's a reporter, institutions of higher education right now are very hesitant to talk about this issue. So, you know, I feel so lucky that we have Lisa from Santa Barbara here today. But to be honest, you know, the issue is they don't want to go on record saying anything before they even know what the decision is going to be. They don't want to share, for example, here's what our plan B is going to be, because again, they don't want to get ahead of the court. So I just want to let you know it may be challenging sometimes, particularly to get admission officers involved. But I do think going through groups like Paulette's group or my own group and many other higher education associations, we can help point you in that direction. The other thing in terms of ideas is, or this is more of a personal favor, because I've been saying this to every reporter who would listen, that this is so much more than about college admissions. And so many of the stories that I have read are about college admissions, which is fair. But this is really about the future of a nation, right? For so many young people in this country, the first time that they experience difference is when they go to college. You heard Lisa's story, mine is very similar. You know, and so it's an opportunity for young people to learn how to engage across difference, to get to know people and communities that they know nothing about. And that has a significant impact in the workforce and society and citizenship. So if you think we're a divided nation now, what happens if our campuses become less diverse? That's what I'm really concerned about. That is what organizations like Apple and Google and AMA and the military who file briefs are very concerned about as well. So the more the media could tell that story, I think the more powerful and impactful it could be.
Mm-hmm. And again, you brought it up earlier, Angel. Diversity means a lot of things. This conversation today is focused a bit more on ethnic diversity, but you're right. Those late night dorm room hallway conversations that students have with other members of their hall who may have had a very different life experience are so critical in shaping the way that student thinks and their attitudes. And those are the attitudes they're going to bring into the workforce. And so again, diversity means a lot of things, not just ethnic diversity.
Yeah, for sure. And just in terms of, although Angel, you said that not many universities are willing to talk about their planning, I did interview the Pomona College president, who is very passionate about the issue. And she said that they will think about eliminating any even optional testing requirements, standardized testing requirements. They may get rid of letters of recommendation, any tool that is now being used that has been shown to have disproportionately negative impact on underserved students. So I'm just wondering, last question, because I think we're going to open it up to the floor. Are there any other ideas that you can see floating out there in terms of how to continue to encourage a diversity, even if race-based admissions or race-based measures at all come into play next spring?
Yeah, I would add, and I've been talking to a lot of our members, some who are in places like California and Michigan, who have been doing this for a long time. And I think where you might see a lot of change is not necessarily in the admissions process, even though there's already been a lot of change, including the fact that the majority of institutions are test optional now. But I think you're probably going to see a lot more work on building the pipeline into the admissions process. Things that Lisa talked about, right? The UC is spending a lot of money on early education and making sure that you are expanding your reach. I know admission officers who said, okay, we can't take race into account. Well, our admission officers are going to go into the Black church, and they are going to go into Latinx community centers. And we are now going to think differently and not just visit high schools or community-based organizations, but think really creatively. Where is it that diverse communities gather? So I think you're going to see a lot of movement there.
Yeah. It is a big shift in resources. It used to be a very traditional model that admission officers would go visit the schools where they were most likely to get applications. You have a limited budget and a limited amount of time you can spend traveling to visit schools. So I know this high school has always been a solid feeder school for my campus. I'm going to go visit that school. Now we have a bit more luxury. With hybrid outreach, right? So it may be that I'm still going to visit those feeder schools to make sure they understand the requirements, but I may do so in a Zoom webinar. And I might instead choose to spend my travel resources going to those underserved schools. So it may be a shift, and it may be less about promoting your own institution and more about promoting higher education. So even though I only have an hour at that school and I might want to talk about why I think Santa Barbara is a great option, there are going to be plenty of times where I say, let's talk about why you should go to college and what you should be looking for in a college. So some of those outreach programs shift from less of a recruitment model to more of a public service model.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think Casey is now joining us to open it up to the audience.
Yes, thanks to everyone who submitted a question. We're going to go through a couple of these. I think we've covered a couple in conversation, but one question that we had was about which states already have bans in place and which is a good test for how this might play out nationally. We talked about that a little bit, but if anyone wants to elaborate.
I can probably list those off, I think. We know Michigan, we know Washington, we know Florida, we know, I think Nevada, no, maybe not Nevada, California, of course. Let's see, give me a couple of others.
I think Texas, right? Isn't that why they instituted their top 10 policy?
Well,
no,
I don't think they have a ban. They've got the top 10.
Colorado, yes, no, I forget.
Yeah.
My understanding is that there's 9 states,
There's
and
9.
we've hit on a couple of them. But are there any that you think are really good examples of kind of what we might be able to expect on a broader scale?
I would put on the table, obviously California. I think Michigan. I think because these are 2 states that are probably friendlier currently than perhaps some others. I think Washington would also be a good place to take a look at. And the reason for obviously pointing to California and U of Michigan is because, you had 2 of the highly selective institutions who have filed amicus, both the system and University of Michigan. And they do speak at length about the extended ways in which they've made adjustments, but that they are not an adequate substitute for their ability to also consider race among many other factors.
Thank you. Another question we got, we touched on this a little bit, Oh, actually, sorry, there's more coming in. I'm going to jump to another then. A question says, it seems a potential ban on affirmative action will be more detrimental to highly selective schools than schools across the board, which seek to boost student enrollment in general. Can you speak further on how impact might be more concentrated among competitive institutions, or is that too narrow a way of looking at this issue?
Yeah, I think it'll have, both a widespread and a concentrated, like it will have a disproportionate impact on a certain chunk of higher education. And I happen to know the number off the top of my head because of, not that it will be affected, that's much more. But we know that because of a research project we're doing, that it's only 222 four-year institutions have an admit rate of 50% or lower. And so that's one way to look at it, that the selective college sphere, it is important to understand that higher education writ large is much bigger than the selective college sphere. And in particular, institutions that disproportionately serve Black and Brown students. That said, that selective college sphere does pack a punch, both, and I think institutions that will be affected by the ban, especially extend, some of even our state flagship institutions have admit rates that are above 50%, but are still, very high, kind of a high stakes, really important pathways for, entry into graduate education, leadership positions, corporate America, all of the like. And so I think that the ban will have a really widespread ripple effect. There's been a lot of research. I recommend Zach Bleemer's research. He tweets a lot. He has some nice Twitter summaries that you can look up on his papers, looking at some of the widespread effects on Prop 209 on, the employment sector, right? And in terms of like the STEM workforce and all of these things, like now that we have decades, right, we're able to trace the impact of decades, right? Of, this isn't just in that what has happened in terms of where students have been pushed into, right? And what is the impact for overall mobility in the state of California? And so that shows, the impact in that state is much bigger than UCLA and Berkeley. It really is something that can impact potentially an entire state.
Mm-hmm. And we haven't talked about community college systems in our different states and how many students will turn to the community college. And unfortunately, the transfer rates of students of color from the community colleges are not as high as they should be, as they could be. So, there needs to be a lot of efforts there. Again, it goes back to retention efforts and advising.
I think the only other thing I would ask people to be clear about is not every student graduates from high school, and not every student decides that they want to go into higher ed, whether that's a 2-year technical or 4-year, And so, we've got to think about the pool of students who first are interested and then are encouraged and then apply and then, are admitted. So, somehow I think there's this belief that every Black student, for example, is interested in going into higher ed, or all Black students who start, matriculate, and graduate. And I especially appreciate the point that there are some majors that have very few students of color, particularly Black and Brown students, that are pursuing those fields. When we think about STEM as one very good example, the need for increased diversity in STEM, not only racial, ethnic diversity, but certainly gender diversity, as well as other ways in which people identify, if we look at the future and employment in STEM, how are we going to diversify the range of STEM, whether it's in the sciences, technology, engineering, mathematics, et cetera? And so, again, going back to the value of having diversity of experiences, race, ethnic, et cetera, is amplified in those amicus briefs. So again, I would encourage folks to understand that and maybe take a look at that.
I think the only thing I wanted to add, because I agree with Julie around the 222 number, and I guess in the context of higher education doesn't sound like a lot. I think the impact, though, will yet to be seen based on what the court says colleges and universities cannot do. So I wouldn't jump to say this will not impact non-selective institutions, because non-selective institutions, as an example, by the names of students who took the SAT in America. And when I was a chief enrollment officer, I sometimes would buy names based on demography or based on race and ethnicity. And that was one way that I can guarantee that I was trying to diversify my applicant pool. Now, if the court says you can't even do that, that is going to impact more than just the most selective sector. So I think, yet to be seen. We really hope that the court does not go there, but it's going to depend on what are the tools that admission officers are going to be allowed to use to both recruit and to admit. So two different pipelines.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to just to make sure it's clear that while just highlight, there's a certain sector, right? But I think there are going to be widespread negative effects that could really ripple across the system.
Another question that we got was about what effect, if any, might this have on HBCUs?
I guess the question might be, are somehow HBCUs not taking race into consideration? That somehow there are students that may very well be participating that are white students or Latinx students or Asian students, where having their presence is not just there for debunking stereotypes, but who have an interest in that experience, who want to be participating at an HBCU. I guess it's a broad question, but to the extent that if an HBCU or other institutions are outside of historically white institutions are considering racial ethnic diversity, they would be impacted by this as well. And if I could just kind of encourage those who are participating in this, there's a lot of myths out there regarding what's the goals and the efforts of higher education in its effort to have racially diverse campuses. And to the extent that we can begin to do some of our own work in this context, that would be very beneficial for organizations like NADAHE, for example, that often have to begin to break down a lot of the myths around race, regarding race-conscious efforts that are utilized and supported by our institutions, even in the context of defining this as affirmative action as opposed to race-conscious admissions, and that's a whole nother part of the story that we could explore at some point.
Yeah, I don't know if the question asker was also thinking about the possibility of, for instance, some of the Black students who, may have been aiming for an elite institution, right? Who knows, Harvard, wherever, might certain HBCUs become more attractive as a safe haven? It's possible. That's both we might see that might be explored both individually and kind of system level. I think something that the question made me think of is, this is sort of like chapter 1 and chapter 10, who knows? And we're going to see what the court says and go from there. But, long term, there's a movement, right? That's funding these lawsuits. And I don't think they're going to stop at college admissions, right? Because Ed Bloom has been involved in trying to take down the Voting Rights Act. And so HBCUs remind me that there's a federal designation both for HBCUs and for predominantly Black institutions and for Hispanic serving institutions, Asian American, et cetera. And so, who knows? Will those institutions be targeted in a future round? I don't know. I hope not. But, I think they are very, very determined. So who knows?
Thank you. Well, I think we are just about at time here. I do want to mention we got a note from one of our helpful journalist members about the states that have banned race-conscious admissions. They include California, Washington, Florida, Michigan, Nebraska, Arizona, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, and Idaho. They also very helpfully included all the years, but we don't have time to go through that. So I want to say thank you so much to our speakers and our moderator, Teresa, for a fantastic conversation. And thanks also to all of the EWA members in attendance today. Just want to make a couple of quick points before we log off. We will be sending a link to an evaluation form by email. Please complete the evaluation. We take our member feedback very seriously and use it to improve our offerings. And finally, also want to give a reminder to visit ewa.org to register for upcoming events like our higher education seminar, which will be in January, and also to sign up for our newsletter so you're the first to know about EWA events and resources. So thank you again, everyone. We really appreciate you making the time, and have a great day.